The White Pill is available now at whitepillbook.com. This episode is brought to you by Patriot Gold. Good afternoon, Michael Malice here. Let that be your welcome for the next hour. We have with us a very special guest, the author of Woke Inc. His new book is called Capitalist Punishment, and he's trying to become the next president, Vivek Ramaswamy. Welcome to the show. We've got a lot to talk about. Let's talk first about your campaign. Why don't you, this is a very softball intro. Who are you? Why should people support your candidacy, and what makes you different from the other candidates?
Yeah, look, I've been an outsider my whole life, actually, in everything I've done. That's what allowed me to build a successful career as an entrepreneur. Taking on bureaucracy is a bit of a profession of mine. I took on a bureaucracy of big pharma in the first stage of my career, ended up founding a multi-billion-dollar biotech company that tackled disease areas that are, frankly, different than what those of the rest of the pharma industry wanted to go after. 5 of those are FDA-approved medicines today. I stepped aside to then tackle the woke industrial complex with my first book, Woke Inc., that lifted the curtain on this toxic new combination of state power and corporate power that tried to perpetuate a new culture that, for a lot of reasons I was critical of. I wrote that book, wrote 2 more ever since, the 3rd book you just mentioned. It's coming out, now, but I decided that I just didn't want to write books. I actually ended up then starting a company called Strive to compete against BlackRock, taking on these financial institutions that were pushing these environmental and social agendas onto corporate America. So that was my career, repeatedly taking on toxic bureaucracies. I built a lot of personal wealth for myself doing it, and that's fine. But I started to ask the question of what it was in our culture that made us as a people want to buy up what these people are selling. And I think that was going to take a national revival to address, something I wasn't going to fix by writing books, something that I wasn't going to fix by even starting companies. That's what led me to run for president. And you asked me what's different about the other candidates. I'm running on my vision of what it actually means to be American. I'm the true outsider in this race. I think you only get to be an outsider once. I'm the outsider in this one. I'm 37 years old. I'm the first millennial to ever run for president as a Republican. I've got fresh legs. Donald Trump was an outsider in 2015. I won't be the same person 8 years from now that I am today. Maybe I'll be more jaded and cynical and tired and defeated. That's not me today. And so what's different is I'm not a product of the political system. I am not a politician. In fact, until December of this last year, I had no idea I'd be running for president. But I do think I'm running on a vision to not just recite the slogans you'll hear from other politicians, but to get to the why, what we believe, why we believe it. And, I think I'm frankly best positioned in this race to not only take the agenda that many conservatives want to take further, to actually take it even further than Donald Trump did, but to unify the country in the process, because I'm doing it based on principles and conviction in moral authority, really, not on grievance and personal vengeance. And I think that that's actually going to allow us to go even further than the likes of Trump have, let alone the other professional politicians who are either entering or looking to enter this race.
One of the things that you say that I think is just absolutely superb and spot on is, for a very long time, the Republican Party and Republican voters had been content to have this almost pro wrestling style focus on politics, where, you shake your fist at Nancy Pelosi or George Mitchell, whoever the leading Democratic congressional person is, while at the same time the New York Times is lobbing bombs at our culture, and the universities are kind of spawning these sort of ideas that in many ways are counterproductive to conservative values. You're a graduate of both Harvard and Yale, so in certain contexts you're patient zero and a bigger danger than COVID was. But I would want to hear you speak about your corporate experience and it's things you talked about in Woke Inc. and things like ESG that you mentioned in your upcoming book. Because is it your view, as it is mine, that Washington is almost the consequence of the issue, and far more of the problems are occurring upstream? And if the focus is on Washington, you're playing in the fourth quarter and you're down 40 points.
I wholly agree with you. I think it's the economy, the culture, and the merger of the economy and our culture, I think, create the politics and even the political divides, which are really just a symptom of a deeper cancer in our country. So I could tell you about the business model if you're really interested of the first company I founded, and taking advantage of really the managerial bureaucracy of big pharma. And that's a long discussion and we can go there. But the question of what you're asking actually related to why I stepped down as a CEO
Yep.
to take on these cultural cancers. And so in 2020, there was a demand that after George Floyd died, prominent CEOs, especially young CEOs across the country, make a statement in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. I keep an open mind, but as I learned about Black Lives Matter, the organization, I didn't agree with what they had to say. I mean, I think that fundamentally it was toxic, I think, for Black lives, for all lives, to say that we should, for example, dismantle the nuclear family structure. That is the single best known form of governance to mankind, more than the state. It's been responsible for lifting up a lot of Black lives, lifting up a lot of people. It's why the Indian American community, for example, I grew up as an Indian American as a kid of immigrants, is why they're so successful in the US, I think is partly grounded in old school family values, two parents in the house with the focus on education. And so I refused to take that position. That set into motion a series of events over the next 6 months that culminated in me having to make a decision. Either I was going to be able to speak through the filter of corporate self-interest and say what pretty much most other CEOs were saying, or I would be free to speak my mind as a citizen, but that means I'd have to hang the corporate self-interest back on the wall. And so I took the latter path. It was already a successful company by that point in time, a multi-billion-dollar business. There was a successor that was ready to take the job. Listen, I said, okay, good. Promoted my CFO to CEO. I said, going forward, my voice is my voice, not that of the company, but I'm going to speak unapologetically. And so that's what led me on this sort of crusade I've been on over the last couple of years against stakeholder capitalism, ESG. Those are fancy words for describing the use of companies to advance agendas that governments couldn't get done through the front door. Companies were effectively taking up those causes, in part due to government pressure, to implement them through the back door instead. And I think shining a light on that has been one of my callings over the last several years, writing the books I have, traveling the country. I'm now at a stage where we need to focus on solutions, but it was a really important phase to first see that problem with clear eyes.
Yeah, there's a lot of disingenuousness in our discourse, and you just touched on one of them. By being against Black Lives Matter, the organization, what people can then say with a straight face, not a straight face, what they would claim is like, oh, so what you're saying is that Black lives don't matter. It's a complete absurdity when you're referring to one corporation, but they will just do that kind of semantic flip and say you're disagreeing with the actual statement, which is indisputable. No one's going to dispute that Black Lives Matter, and Black Lives Matter enormously. Can you talk a bit about what that pressure was like on you as a CEO at the time? I'm thinking specifically of the guy from CrossFit who made the point that goes, we're an exercise organization. We have nothing.
Yep.
We're completely colorblind, very diverse. Everyone comes in, get injured and then leave, get fit, but we're not. And the guy got, kicked out. So can you talk a bit about that, what that pressure was like at the time for you?
Yeah, look, it was eye-opening is what it was. I was frustrating at times, I guess I would say, but it was something I was just deeply curious about, like what the heck is going on in our culture where we're working on medicines that have the potential, and several of them have gone on to positively change a lot of lives. That's unifying. No matter black, white, gay, straight, Democrat, Republican, doesn't matter. In fact, very few of the people that I worked with, it's hard to believe now, had any iota of inclination of what my substantive views were on cultural or political conflicts of the day. Like maybe 2 or 3 people who I happen to be friends with outside of work. That was about it. Nobody else had a clue. And I think that was a good thing because we were unified in common cause by creating this apolitical sanctuary where we were working on something worthwhile, creating value by developing medicines. So it was interesting to me. I think the thing that was hardest about it, though, is especially when younger employees, and some of them weren't younger, a couple of them were older, I think I had a sense of disappointment in me, right? Because they looked up to me as a guy who was their leader, who was, yes, working on making the world a better place, assumed that my views must be aligned with theirs because many of them had earnestly held views. Some of them were among those that would go after Black Lives Matter protests in the streets. peaceful ones in any way as they existed, not in the violent riots. And so these are good people, but who had fundamental disagreements. And the hard part for me was the feeling that, look, these are earnest people who followed me on this mission and now feel disappointed in me as their leader, right? Like the hard part about taking anybody the easy part is somebody who's looking to shout you down or,
Yep.
is unreasonable or has ill intentions to be. No, we have no room or appetite for people who are going to distract this company from their mission. Here's what we're doing. But people who earnestly, just in their heart of hearts, not because they're even voicing it, but because publicly, but because that's how they even feel privately. Those were the harder conversations for me, for people who just felt, I think like one individual particularly said, Vivek, what happened to you? And as though they couldn't believe that like some spirit has taken me over in a way that was different than the leader they thought they saw. But at the end of the day, you can't please everybody. I think that my goal isn't to please the people I lead, just like a parent to a kid. Your goal is to actually lead them. And I hope that through my example, I've demonstrated that even though I'm critical of the transgender movement across this country for its oppressiveness, and I do think that there is an oppression, especially on children and other parts of our culture, I also respect the dignity of each individual to be respected as a human being, even if they suffer from a mental health condition. Even though I don't endorse the big lavish mansions organization, I say sometimes that's what BLM stands for, because that's what the corporation, as you said, uses their money for,
Yeah.
to buy $6-7 million mansions in Southern California and then claim grievance on the back of it. No, I don't endorse that. But I do care deeply about empowering all Americans, including Black Americans who are in communities that are disproportionately left behind because of teachers' unions, because of the failure to focus on education and family formation. I care deeply about these things. I went to a racially diverse public high school, public junior high school, 1st through 8th grade, before actually having to go to a private high school thereafter. And I would say that there wasn't a single one of those Black kids that couldn't have achieved everything I have in my life if they had been given that same stable family foundation and focus on education. So I care deeply about these things, and I hope that what comes across through a lot of my criticisms, and they are unsparing criticisms, believe me, in my book and otherwise, of the woke culture, of the victimhood culture, of the trans culture, of the climatism, whatever it is, the cultural voids that are preyed upon by these toxic new religions in American life. I'm very critical of them, but through that criticism, it's not because I care about just deconstructing some postmodern dogma. It's because I care about helping people, helping ourselves in a way that allows us to be the nation that I remembered growing up in not that long ago, the nation that I was born into, the one I learned to pledge allegiance to. That's not the country I see today, but it's actually my genuine care about reviving that for people that leads me on this mission. And I don't know. I mean, I've lost some friends over it in the last couple of years, or people who I enjoyed going to law school with, who I enjoyed building a great company with. And there's just a distance that forms. I mean, very few occasionally you get like an angry email from some crazy crusader you didn't know that well in the first place. For the people you really know well, it's almost a sadder story of just a slow, quiet divergence, right? You stop texting each other as much. I try my best, but then at a certain point, then it starts to feel unnatural. You're talking about something different than, I spend a lot of my airtime talking about. I'm a public figure now. And, it feels artificial where we'll be talking about something else where, we've got kids, they've got kids. Part of that's just growing up, but part of it is there's a certain sadness to it that makes it difficult, of either people who, good people that you respected, you were friends with, that you worked in the trenches with and building a company together, that, now are sort of ships at bay. That's tougher than the crusader protester that, shows up with some sort of militant flag that, needs to be defeated in argument. That's the easy stuff. The harder stuff is some of the relationships that I hope come back. I do, but that's probably the hardest part of the whole thing.
Folks, did you know that your temperature at night can have one of the greatest impacts on your sleep quality? If you wake up too hot or too cold, I highly recommend you check out Miracle Made's bed sheets. They're inspired by silver-infused fabrics made by NASA. Miracle Made makes temperature-regulated bedding so you can sleep at the perfect temperature all night long. They have self-cooling properties for better quality sleep using silk-infused fabrics originally developed by NASA. They're thermoregulating, designed to keep you at the perfect temperature all night long. You get better sleep every night. And they're self-cleaning. They're infused with natural silver, which prevents 99.9% of bacterial growth, leaving them to stay cleaner and fresher 3 times longer than other sheets. No more gross odors. They're luxuriously comfortable without the high price tag of other luxury brands. Stop sleeping on bacteria. Clean sheets means less bacteria to clog your pores, fewer breakouts, and other skin problems. All you got to do is go to trymiracle.com/malice to try Miracle Made sheets today. And with Mother's and Father's Day right around the corner, this is the perfect way to give someone you love the gift of better and more luxurious sleep. Save over 40%. Be sure to use the promo code MALICE at checkout to save even more, and you get 3 free towels. Miracle is so confident in their product, it's backed with a 30-day money-back guarantee. If you aren't 100% satisfied, you get a full refund. Upgrade your sleep with Miracle Made. Go to trymiracle.com/malice. Use code MALICE to get your free 3-piece towel set. Save 40% off. That's trymiracle.com/malice to treat yourself to a better night's sleep. Thank you, Miracle Made, for sponsoring this episode. Folks, cold turkey may be great on sandwiches, but there's a better way to break your bad habits. I'm not talking about some weird mind voodoo from my crazy neighbor. You know who it is. We're talking about our sponsor, Fume, F-U-M, and they look at the problem in a different way. Not everything in a bad habit is wrong. So instead of a drastic, uncomfortable change, why not just remove the bad from your habit? And Fume is an innovative, award-nominated device that does just that. Instead of electronics, Fume is completely natural. Instead of vapor, Fume uses flavored air. And instead of harmful chemicals, they use all natural, delicious flavors. You get it. Instead of bad, Fume is good. It's a habit you're free to enjoy and makes replacing your bad habit easy. And your Fume comes with an adjustable airflow dial and is designed with movable parts and magnets for fidgeting. So it gives your fingers a lot to do, which is helpful for de-stressing and anxiety while breaking your habit. Stopping is something a lot of people put off because it's hard, but switching to Fume is easy, enjoyable, and even fun. Fume has served over 100,000 customers and has thousands of success stories, and there's no reason it can't be you. Join Fume in accelerating humanity's breakup from destructive habits by picking up the Journey Pack today. Head to tryfume.com and use code MALICE to save 10% when you get the Journey Pack today. That's tryfum.com. Use code MALICE to save 10% off your order today. You know Dave Smith and his very failed podcast and how he's always playing around with that device of his. Do you want to be like him? Of course not. It's a disaster. Tryfume.com. Use promo code MALICE and get control of your bad habit. Don't be like Dave. Let's get back to the show. I'm an immigrant. Your parents are from India. And for me, American identity politics discourse is so stupid and dishonest that I don't even know where to start. First of all, if you're going to have this kind of black-brown coalition, not only is the black experience not a uniform, African Americans and Caribbean Americans or African immigrants are all having very different experiences. Someone from Mexico and someone from Venezuela and someone from Cuba are going to have very different perspectives. In many cases, they will hate each other. And it's funny because people who are from the South Asian area, you guys get shunted sometimes by skin color. They want to put you with black and brown. Sometimes due to high achievement, you get shunted as Asian, as if someone from India and someone from Korea are somehow interchangeable. Can you speak a bit on how that fed into your perspective? Because I think especially Indian Americans are just made invisible because you don't fit any good narratives, and therefore you have no use in that purpose.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that just because two people look like each other doesn't have anything to do with whether or not their life experiences are actually the same. There's a lot of diversity in life experiences that come from things other than skin color. And just because you look like somebody who committed an injustice 250 years ago, or you look like somebody who suffered an injustice 250 years ago, we're now in a world and a culture and a policymaking landscape that says we're going to treat you like somebody who did something right or wrong a long time ago because you look like somebody who did or didn't. That's kind of the world we live in today. It's interesting, even in the Indian American community. So my parents' generation, they were the immigrants. They went through the real hardships, right?
Yeah.
Crossing an ocean halfway around the world before the internet, before all the modern comforts of being able to be globally connected or whatever. Like, that's real hard. Now, we didn't grow up in the classical version of monetary privilege, my generation. You know, certainly me and my wife had a very similar story in her household. But we were the ones who got ahead through achievement, through parents who valued education. But the funny thing is our kids' generation, I see it in my nieces and nephews too, even in the Indian American community, the trend you now see is that they're now taught to see themselves as persons of color, right? Yeah. Amalgamating themselves with a bunch of Venezuelan, Cuban, black, bunch of other people from totally different backgrounds amalgamated in this one wrapper of persons of color as though it's one category, because victimhood is a currency. And you can play that currency if you can wield it. So we create the incentives for people to see themselves that way. I think same things, by the way, going on in this never-ending alphabet soup of LGBTQI. There's so many letters, they just put a little plus at the end of it. But, gay people for the longest time earned gay rights by saying that we're born this way. The sex of the person I'm attracted to is hardwired in the day we're born. But then the T in the LGBTQ, the T in that makes the exact opposite claim. It says my own sex is completely fluid over the course of my life. These two things don't even make sense. They're fundamentally at odds with each other. And yet we just lump them all together because that creates a strength in numbers to advocate for a victimhood status. Anyway, you asked about Indian Americans. I think part of what shaped my view is that from a young age, look, growing up in Southwest Ohio as the kid of immigrants, skinny, nerdy kid with a funny last name and a dad with a thick accent, you stand out a little bit, and that's okay. It's part of what shaped who I am. Hardship is not the same as victimhood. It was actually something that my parents actually taught me from a young age. Hardship is not a choice. It's going to happen. Victimhood is a choice. It's how you deal with hardship. But one of the things I have experienced is I don't like to wallow in my own victimhood narratives. I rarely talk about this stuff. I'm just bringing it up because you asked about it. I have absolutely experienced racism growing up, and I've experienced racism from white people. I've experienced racism from black people growing up. And maybe it was because I went to a junior high school that was majority minority, but there's a part of my upbringing where I experienced probably more racism from black people than I did from white people. Although I've experienced my share of both. That'll make some people very uncomfortable, I suppose, for me to say that out loud, but it's just the fact of, if I may invoke it, my lived experience, as though there is any other kind. I hate that expression, but I'm invoking it for a reason because it is true. It's just a fact of my experience. I think racism is an ugly thing. It can run in many different directions. Anti-white, anti-black, anti-Asian, anti-white, anti-black, institutionalized. We've had institutionalized anti-black racism in this country for much of the nation's history. Slavery, pre-civil rights. I think we now have institutionalized anti-Asian, anti-Indian, anti-white racism in the form of affirmative action. I think it's wrong no matter what form it shows up in. But I hope the place we can get is not to wallow in our respective grievance stories, play the oppression Olympics and say that, oh, my victimhood tale was bigger than yours and therefore I deserve more in response, and just say there's no gold medalist in this oppression Olympics. We all lose in the end. Maybe China wins, but we in this country all lose. And the only way we're going to get ahead is actually by asking how we move forward past everyone's grievance tale. Because if you're looking at it under a microscope, everybody's going to have some claim on victimhood or grievance. It's a never-ending losing battle. And I think that if we're going to care about lifting up all Americans, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, it doesn't matter, we're going to have to revive a common commitment to things like merit and excellence in this country again, or else we're all just in one giant spiral to the bottom, fighting over a shrinking pie on how we divide it up. That isn't the America I grew up in, and it's not the America I intend to lead. That's why I'm running for president.
There are a couple of cases before the Supreme Court. I believe they're being combined regarding Asian American admittance to the Ivy Leagues. Clarence Thomas, this has been basically his fantasy for decades to be able to adjudicate on this. I don't think there's any person on earth who despises these sort of affirmative action or set-asides more than him. He spoke about it constantly. What is your perspective as a graduate of both Harvard and Yale regarding these cases? And as president, would you support a Justice Department that would basically allow this case to go forward in favor of banning these practices?
Absolutely. In fact, I'm the first presidential candidate in U.S. history. I said it on day one of this campaign, saying that I would end race-based affirmative action in America. Now, how can a president do that by executive order? You want to know why? It was created by an executive order. Not a lot of people know that. It's actually executive order, I remember the number, 11246. Lyndon Johnson signed it into effect. And it's not just for the government. This one relates to the workforce. It says that anybody who does business with the federal government, all right, that's over 20% of the U.S. workforce working for companies that fit this description. Think about that. Over 20% of the U.S. workforce works for a company that has to adopt these toxic race-based quotas. affirmative action, it's a cancer on our national soul. And I think it's been to the detriment of Harvard and Yale and other places which have a culture of mediocrity, increasingly ossified by these race-based quota systems. But it's not that different than working at a given company these days too. I think if most people are really honest about it, ask yourself who got that promotion at work. Ask yourself who got that job, whose kid got into college at that precious seat at Harvard or Yale. Was it really the person who was most qualified for that position, who would excel in that seat? Or was it somebody who in part got their position because of the color of their skin? My sense is most people, if they're answering that question honestly today in the country, will say it's more of the latter and less of the former day by day. Now, you can't say that out loud, but I have little doubt in my mind that's the experience of anybody who's in the workforce or whose kids are applying to college today. That's just reality. I don't think that has to be reality. The next U.S. president can actually change this. Now, I pushed Trump's people on this, actually. I asked them, the U.S. president can do this. Why didn't you do it? People in his domestic policy team said, I think their exact words were something like, this was not a political hill we wanted to die on.
Wow.
I think that's the wrong way to look at it. You got to be unafraid, right? And that's a big part of, you asked me in the beginning, why am I in this race? I am the true outsider in this race, right? I think I'm going to take much of that America First agenda further than Donald Trump ever did. Now, I think he's the next best guy to do that. He was the first best guy to do it in 2015 to 2016. He went as far as he was going to go, but to go to the next level, part of what I'm doing is I'm speaking some hard truths here on this campaign trail. I've already taken criticism for you. Probably you were referring, we were talking offline to my exchange with Don Lemon on CNN. I will not shy away from anyone or anything in speaking truth when it needs to be spoken. Affirmative action, end it. Climate cult based on totally false premises. I reject the anti-carbon framework. It's just true. I'm not saying it to be provocative or anything else. It's fundamentally false premises, this climate change agenda mythology. Shutting down government agencies, using the military to secure the border. I mean, taking on transgenderism as a mental health disorder, which is what it is. I think you're going to need a president in this country that's willing to speak with conviction rather than through, I said before, the filter of corporate self-interest, and that's why I stepped aside from my corporate seat. It's also why I'm not a politician, but I think that we're going to need a non-politician in the White House if we actually want to gut the very system and the bureaucracies that create these toxic ideologies. And so anyway, affirmative action's top of the list. It's doable. The next president can do it. Every president since Lyndon Johnson could have done it. They didn't. People may say it's easier because I don't have white skin. I don't necessarily think that's true, but whatever reason it is, maybe because I'm millennial, maybe because I'm Indian American, maybe because I just don't care and I've spent enough of my life actually taking this stuff on that I have crossed that Rubicon already. Whatever it is, I'm going to do it. And that's part of the premise for why I'm in this race, is not just to make that point, but to go the distance and actually get the thing done. And I think for a lot of the same reasons the country went for Trump in 2016, I think that's where they're going to come our way this time around.
I'm thinking of Larry Elder's campaign for governor of California and Herschel Walker's campaign for senator of Georgia, where they were both with a straight face referred to in the press as white nationalists. You're going to be called a white nationalist as well.
Actually, I actually anticipated that. So I've given myself a different term because I am kind of nationalistic in my instincts. I'm unapologetically pro-American. I have dubbed myself a non-white nationalist because I'm non-white and I'm a nationalist. So you can call me a non-white nationalist.
But in all seriousness, you're married, you've got kids. Is there a part of you that's you have to? You're a very bright man. You do understand the toxicity in our politics. This is very much by design. They're trying to make politics as radioactive as possible so that people who play by the game are not going to get hits, whereas people who kind of counter the narrative are going to be completely eviscerated and their families targeted as well. Like, why are you doing this to them? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, on some level, there has to be like, do I really need all this? You know what I mean?
It's like a type of like masochism.
Okay.
It's a good question. So far, I have to admit, it hasn't been as painful as I expected it to be. We went into this with the vision of there's going to be sacrifice.
Yeah.
It's actually been so far. I don't want to eat my words later or jinx our family at all in any way. But so far it's been okay, actually. I think one of the things that's we decided very early on is we're just going to travel as a family as much as we can. I mean, my wife is a surgeon, academic surgeon at Ohio State with her own busy schedule. She's a throat surgeon, but we're still just like making it work. Bus tour in New Hampshire for 6 days. Great. We did it together as a family, riding the bus together. I think that the first week of the campaign was very disorienting. I'm just like 6 different places, waking up like, where am I, kind of thing. But, I think the grounding of doing it as a family, I think, is something that makes it a little bit, a little bit less masochistic on our family. I think the other thing is at a certain point, you just learn to stop caring what other people say about you, as long as what you're saying and doing is actually true. That sounds easy. It's easier said than done. And I think we're all human beings and we're not going to do that perfectly, but I think we're mostly doing it, actually. Even my wife, who I give her a lot of credit for, she's not in the public eye. She's got her own career, but it's not an easy thing to see people say things about your husband or whatever that are just like sometimes like flat out untrue. Like not even big pictures. Like there was a funny one the other day. Like we're just like laughing about it. Like on the internet, like it turns out since I launched for president, like apparently my height is 5'7". I'm 6 foot tall. I don't really care. Who cares how tall you are? It doesn't matter. Same thing, color of your skin. I don't care about these genetically inherited attributes, but like, there's just like a literally disprovable fact, but it's just the example of the other kinds of stuff that you'll hear. Like I'm affiliated with the World Economic Forum, which irritated the hell out of me and also my wife, which is after spending 3 years of being the world's, certainly this country's biggest crusader against that, you're going to have somebody say something like that about you. Well, turns out they put my picture on their website. So you said, we're going to have some truth with this. We'll sue them. So, I just filed a lawsuit against the World Economic Forum for using my name and image, literally without my permission. And even after they were notified to take it down. So I think that's kind of the attitude we're taking, is that we're going to speak truth at every step. If you're in our way, we'll run straight through you. Not because we don't like you, but because we like truth and we're going to get to truth. And I think that with that attitude, this actually becomes pretty doable. And with the family that's bought into it and raising kids that you want to inculcate those same values into, you got to live the values you want to impart to them. That's part of what we're doing. And my kids are young, but my 3-year-old's not as young as you'd think. Even at the age of 3, they're impressionable. They know what they're hearing. They know what they see their parents are doing. They know that, I don't think he knows what the words mean. He knows that I'm running for president. He knows that we believe it's important. He knows that I talk about freedom of speech because he says the same words. We've explained to him what it means. You can see his eyes. He's listening to some sort of idea of processing what that might mean. You got to walk the walk in some ways. And so that's what we're trying to do. And I think that's actually made it, there's a lot of sacrifices involved, but made it a, bearable and at times, dare I say, even fun process so far. And we're going to try to keep it that way.
As beautiful as the vision of a mom holding her newborn baby is, I think I'm suing the World Economic Forum because they're implying I'm associated with them might be something on a level of beauty as a woman holding her newborn kid. So God bless you for that. Folks, experts say that China is hoarding a massive amount of food. They'll soon have over 2/3 of the globe's corn reserves, over half its rice, and over half its wheat. But when asked about it, China lies. One China expert said, they, of course, will never admit to doing something like that. Well, what does China know that we don't? When it comes to global food shortages, China is the canary in the coal mine. You see, China is the world's #1 food importer. They rely on the rest of the world to keep their people fed, so they can't afford to mess up, or there'll be riots, civil panics, or even worse, when over 1 billion people can't eat. So what does this mean for Americans? 2 words: food shortages. That's why it's a smart idea to stock up on a kit of the best-selling 4 Patriots survival food. You can create your own stockpile of the best-selling 4 Patriots survival food kits, which are hand-packed in the USA. They're compact and stack easily, and they have delicious different breakfasts, lunches, and dinners. And their 5-star reviews on the website rave about the flavor and taste. Right now, you get 10% off of 4 Patriots survival food by typing in the code MALICE at checkout. Go to 4Patriots, that's the number 4, 4patriots.com, and use code MALICE to get 10% off your first purchase of 4 Patriots survival food. That's 4patriots.com, use code MALICE. Let's get back to the show. Let's talk a bit about staffing. You've been very successful in your career. You're green when it comes to politics. There's going to be no shortage probably of Republican or independent contractors who'll be happy to tell you what you want to hear and take a big paycheck from you. They did this very famously with Giuliani when he ran for president. They're like, oh yeah, we'll just start the campaign in Florida. And, he had been leading in the polls and he was DOA. This was a major criticism of President Trump's administration, where he promised to drain the swamp, and then he's hiring John Bolton and Reince Priebus and things like that. How are you distinguishing when it comes to staffing? Who are the people who, I can count on this guy, or this guy just sees me as a cash register?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't take getting exploited lightly. I'll call out corruption wherever I see it. If we're going to call that out in the federal government, let's start with this process, right? So I see a lot of grifting going on in the political industry, and maybe we have some of them working in part of our expansive growing campaign, but we're going to root that out and kind of bring the pesticide pretty quickly. I haven't seen any of it yet, but we're pretty vigilant about that. One of the things, for example, that we're thinking about doing that's just a different idea. Well, one thing we're already doing is we're doing a daily podcast. All my briefings are in front of the camera. We'll release them as podcasts. We don't like to hide and create this artifice that I'm prepared behind the scenes and then show up and pretend like I knew everything I was talking about that I learned 15 minutes ago. We don't play that game here. Even when it comes to fundraising, though, I mean, there's these big fundraisers, and, we haven't really started doing professional fundraisers yet. I mostly focused on, I wrote an 8-figure check into the campaign to kick this off. And then we got 20,000 small dollar donors in less than 2 months, which is, earth shattering for a new candidate that has no baseline political history, political donor list, et cetera. So that's been huge. We started at 0.0% less than 2 months, or polling at 3% nationally. So by political standards, it's a rocket ship. And I give a lot of credit to actually the non-grifting team that I brought here. It's part of a team, part of why I wanted an Ohio-based team. So Ohio's home base. It's where I grew up. It's where I live now. It's where the campaign headquarters is. But the team that I chose, and one of the things that they do is they have a general consultant. People in the politics world will know this, but outside the politics world, the general structure is you have a campaign manager, and then you have a general consultant to the campaign. And it's just like a lot of unnecessary managerial layers and overhead for nothing. I said, I don't want that structure. I'm going to put a CEO in charge of the campaign. So I have a campaign CEO. I don't have a general consultant and a campaign manager. I have a CEO of the campaign. We're running this like a company. And so that's, some of the mentality we brought to it. I'm an in-person culture. People aren't working remotely. And I always put working remotely in air quotes because that's what it often ends up being. They're in this office, right? We have a podcast studio built in our office. In-person culture, in-person first culture, for just like I'd run a company, just like I'm running this campaign. So I think that's a little bit different. I don't really take a lot of BS. The World Economic Forum wants to mess around, I'll sue them, right? So that's the mentality we're going to need, where I say I'm going to go into the federal government, take a look at the Department of Education, which is a toxic government agency that spends $83 billion a year foisting radical race and gender ideologies on the local schools when the federal government should have nothing to do with it. I'm not just going to reform it by putting a figurehead like Betsy DeVos on top. And, I give Trump and Betsy DeVos credit. I like Trump. I like Betsy DeVos. But that's not going to fix the Department of Education, because we still have a toxic Department of Education. What I've said is I'm going to get in there. I'll shut the thing down because it shouldn't have existed in the first place. And guess what? I actually have a strong view of my constitutional authority to do it. And you want to talk about how to use the money? 25% of it would put 3 armed security guards in every single school across this country. That's how you actually protect kids, not by taking away guns from law-abiding citizens. Oh, and by the way, while we're at it, if you actually want to just either give the money back to the people for the remainder, or fund school choice programs, which supposedly are underfunded, which is the number one argument against them. I mean, this is just a way of thinking that you're not going to get from a professional politician. I mean, I think that there's a lot of career politicians who are contemplating entering this race. I can name them. It doesn't even matter who they are. They're all, more or less cut from similar cloths. Well-intentioned people, but not going to be able to go to the, dare I say, extreme steps that I plan to take. But I don't think they're that extreme at all. I think they're just the embodiment of the radical American principles that set our entire country into motion in the first place anyway. And so, that's part of why I'm in this race. And, not only in this race, but why we intend to govern for 8 years in a way that revives our national soul. Same way I've actually built my career by the age of 37. Look, I've founded multi-billion-dollar companies, taken on big bureaucracies, speak truth to power. I've been doing that for most of my career. It's led me to live the full arc of the American dream. I'm the first millennial candidate ever to run for U.S. president as a Republican, as I said earlier. And, I don't intend to do things differently in the next stage of actually running for the White House and then running the country. I think part of what people want is that outsider spirit. And I'm not going to apologize for bringing that to the table.
Something that I'm extremely curious to hear you speak about at length is a lot of people, to my understanding, are completely unaware of how negative and deleterious the FDA is in practice.
Oh,
That
yeah.
oftentimes there are many drugs that are actually preventatives for cancer and all these other things. And it's much easier to get a drug approved that is a tweak on a pre-existing medication than something that is innovative, because you have to go through human trials. As a result of this, many lives are actually being lost. I have a friend who's an investor in this field, and he just really regards it as a malevolent organization, because like we have technology right now. If I'm definitely going to die, if I have a terminal illness, just let me be the experiment, because what have I got to lose kind of situation? The answer is no. Can you please, from your professional experience, speak a bit about how the FDA works in practice, and if what I'm just saying is accurate at all?
It is accurate. It is a toxic organization. And for years, when I was affiliated with a biotech company, the one thing they tell you is FDA never forgets. It's like almost like a threat. Like if you say something that's critical of FDA, you're going to actually get deep state treatment. And this is stuff that like in the pharmaceutical industry is well known, right? So if you start using words like deep state, you're like, oh, you're like some sort of rube on the outside, not scientifically sophisticated. But in the industry, it is an adage among people in the regulatory functions of pharmaceutical companies. FDA never forgets. That's not the way the system's supposed to work. The FDA has a limited grant of statutory power. Their decisions, actually, people forget this, are challengeable through the federal court system. But when they say FDA never forgets, they mean that if you're in the industry and you're playing by the rules, like the genteel rules of being treated well, if you're one of those companies that actually challenges an FDA ruling, you won't be treated well the next time around, right? They have, I mean, it is such a corrupt bureaucracy. It's funded by user fees from the companies. The companies themselves are repeat players with the FDA. The decisions made by some technocrat you've never heard of. I mean, this is a guy wielding undue political and economic power, and even power over the health of lives of people across this country who could be getting medicines a lot faster and a lot more cheaply if the FDA didn't apply its draconian regime the way it does, selectively, by the way. For some drugs and some vaccines, it has to take 10, 12 years or it can't be the case. In other cases, COVID, whatever it is, we're going to develop that in record time, say that it's so safe and effective that we're going to back mandates to actually use it. You can't believe these things at the same time. It's just bureaucratic shooting from the hip. It is a toxic organization that I intend to reform with a first personal understanding of how corrupt that bureaucracy actually is. And you know what? Now that I'm not part of a biotech company that I founded, I'm finally not only free to talk about it, I also intend to run the federal government. As the chief executive of this country ought to run the federal government, right? The biggest myth that we have in American constitutional self-governance is this idea that the people who we elect to run the government are the ones who actually run the government. They don't. It's the permanent state that runs the show. It wasn't Biden. Trump was the closest thing we got to, and it wasn't Trump. Certainly wasn't Obama. Certainly wasn't George Bush. I'm going to fix that. Right. So that's part of, and I can get into the details and the mechanics of how I do it, or we don't have to do that here. Maybe that's for, another, I don't know. I have no idea what your audience is interested in. You know that better than I do, but
no, they're very interested in this because this
really?
is something where I mean, this is something where there's just a lot of glib discussion, but when you get to the nuts and bolts of the situation, it's so much more darker and disturbing. And corporate media like CNN or Fox, not asking you to disparage them, but they have these 5-minute clips, and you're not going to get an understanding of how systemic this rot is. And what that means is this isn't like, oh, I can't get soda at the store. This means that, someone who has prostate cancer is dying when they don't need to be dying. This means someone's going through chemo when there's another medication they could take that's not going to bring them as close as possible to the brink of death and holding up in abolishing the cancer. So, and this is something you're not talking as a politician. This is something you've lived, and this is how you made your money. So please do speak on it at some length, because I think this is extremely crucial and totally undiscussed.
So, or that when that therapy does make it, it's 5 times more expensive and I can't afford it because the FDA actually created that monopoly. And then the FDA companies arbitrage them back. They use then the FDA as a safeguard to prevent somebody else from being able to cross the same finish
Can you
line.
explain what you mean by that? What you just said?
Yeah, I mean, it gets sort of technical. So the FDA has to approve a label, right? So it's like the drugs, side effects, and safety, and whatever. So what they do is they game the system a little bit. You're only supposed to have 5 years of exclusivity, or the years that you have until patent expiry. Those are the two forms of exclusivity. But then what they'll do is they'll patent something in the label, like the dose form that's in the label, but make it really hard for a generic to make that same kind of dose form. And then because that's patented, the generic company can effectively give you something that's basically the same thing, but because they have to go through the FDA process, they say that if you want to get the same label, then you actually had to do the full swath of trials, even though the entire FDA regime was set up, the entire drug approval process was set up on the premise that after your patent expires, generics have a rapid path to market as long as they demonstrate the same biological and chemical qualities without having to go through human clinical trials. And so pharma companies will patent the way the label is written to use the FDA as a blocking channel from what the patent system told the generic companies that they were free to do. All of this contributes to the higher cost of drugs in this country. It's just game playing. Now, do I even blame companies for this?
Of course,
No.
they have to. If you're a CEO and you don't do this,
Yes.
you're out in your ass because you're leaving all the money on the table.
Yeah, so I'm not criticizing. Exactly. You get it. Thank you. I'm not blaming, and the irresponsible thing that Joe Biden will do, we'll talk about the greedy oil companies or the pharma companies. I mean, there's a lot wrong with pharma companies. I don't like it when they lie. That's a separate question. But this kind of behavior is just doing what a pharma company is expected to do. When they lie about saying we're going to then also implement a racial equity program and talk about systemic racism and climate change. That's a deflection to get the public away from being mad about these other things they're doing. That's the lying part. But the part where the company is doing what's responsive to its own self-interest, I don't blame the company for that. I blame the government for creating this toxic labyrinthine game that actually leaves the public holding the bag. So when I talk about how to reform this as the CEO of the country, right, as the president of the United States, you got to be able to fire people. I'll tell you something. If you run the executive branch of the government, Article 2 of the Constitution says that you do. If you're the duly elected president, it turns out. If you run the executive branch and you cannot fire people who work for you, that means they don't work for you.
Yeah.
It means you work for them. And in a very literal sense, the culture of the federal government today feels like a U.S. president who works for the permanent state that was around long before he arrived and will be around long after he leaves. And so that's why I've said, the way I'm running the federal government is that if I'm not going to collect a paycheck from the federal government for more than 8 years, which I think is a good thing, then neither is anybody who's working for me, period. Replace these so-called civil service protections with 8-year sunset clauses instead. Now let's talk about the budgeting process a little bit. The way the budgeting process is supposed to work, the way it used to work, is that the executive branch asks for permission to spend the public's money. It's taxpayer money. It doesn't belong to the president, doesn't belong to a 3-letter agency. It belongs to the public. So you ask for permission to spend that money. And the way it used to work is Congress would say, okay, you may, executive branch, spend this money. What's happened over the years, over the decades, is as the administrative state proliferated, 3-letter agencies from SEC to FTC to TSA to FDA, I mean, the alphabet soup goes on.
Yeah.
The people who you elected as president, who we elected as president, start to get lazy. They said, all right, well, agencies just talk to Congress directly, work it out. Congress is lazy. What do they say? Submit a draft budget proposal. We'll put that in, and then the language just gets baked into the statutes that are passed. So the administrative agency had started to be empowered. Instead of actually writing the language to say that we may spend this money, they started writing the bill language to say we shall spend this money. So then what happens is Congress passes these budgets. They don't know what they're passing. I mean, these guys are, many of them.
They don't have a chance time to read them.
It's a joke. It's a joke of a process. They don't have some combination between time and lack of intellectual curiosity and lack of procedural discipline. But the fact is they don't read them. So now the norm is the way these budgets get passed is what used to be a permission from Congress to the executive branch that says you may spend it has become a verbiage that says you shall spend it. So that then comes to the executive. So say you're someone like me and that budget shows up and say, well, I want to shut down the Department of Education. The deep state gets to say, no, President, you don't get to do that to me because Congress told you that you shall spend it. So you don't have a choice. That is how the deep state wins. And so I'm getting into details here because you said your audience is interested in
No,
it.
you're
I could
talking.
go on for hours about this stuff, but the mechanics matter.
Yes.
And so the way I would run the federal government, I will run the federal government if the people of this country put me in that position, is to say, no. The budgeting process runs through the White House. It runs through me, where we will actually be humble about this. We're asking Congress for permission. We can't spend $1 unless Congress gives us permission to. But we're going to ask for permission, and those budget requests are going to say that we may spend it. But if that's going to be waste, fraud, abuse, or worse, and worse means the loss of democratic self-governance where some bureaucrat actually makes policy decisions that they had no business making, then we will shut you down. Department of Education, to FBI, to IRS, to Nuclear Regulatory Commission, to 90% of the headcount of the U.S. Federal Reserve, to much of the headcount of the FDA. You shouldn't be here. Okay, and I'm going to run the executive branch the way I was elected by the people of this country to run it, without apology, rather than being some puppet that sits in the White House, which is how it works today. And I think it's going to require somebody who is both an outsider, but also has a bone deep constitutional conviction. I mean, maybe I began in my Yale Law School days, but thereafter, it's going to take both, right? You need to be a scholar of this stuff, but also not just be some academic scholar that's policy pontificating, but actually behave like an executive. And that's why I felt called to do this, is that, and I think being young and having fresh legs doesn't hurt. Might help, right? A little bit of energy and a little bit of non-jadedness. I think that's what it's going to take to actually cut through what is this ossified managerial bureaucracy. You don't just reform it. You don't even just drain it. You gut the thing. That's what I'm going in to do.
Hey, Vivek, before we move on to the next issue, I want to take a second to talk to the audience about something that matters a lot, and that's keeping their money secure. Have you seen what's going on around us? You've got the Silicon Valley Bank collapse. You've got the government trying to bail them out with our taxpayer money. Saudi Arabia is meeting with China to accept yuan for oil purchases. This might be the end of the petrodollar. And Xi Jinping, of course, is meeting with Putin in Russia. Behind the scenes, while we're not paying attention, MasterCard, Citigroup, and other global banking giants have started a digital dollar pilot, or what they call Biden bucks. Biden has fast-tracked its development. What does that mean? The Fed can monitor every transaction and devalue purchasing power even more. Do you know where else they have digital money? China. China's digital currency helps the CCP punish or coerce citizens with social credit systems in place. If a citizen commits even a minor infraction, they can be blacklisted from traveling, going to restaurants, renting a home, or having insurance. You don't think it would happen here? Look what happened during the COVID mandates. Digital is currently a major step in expanding authoritarianism, and countries all over the world are poised to adopt central bank digital currencies, which are programmable forms of fiat money, which allow them to track, trace, and freeze a person's funds. The corporate press wants you to watch Biden give money away to Ukraine, and presidential hopefuls in the Republican Party are joining suit as they announce their bids for 2024. And according to Bloomberg, the world is in the midst of a macroeconomic reset. What's the shining star? Gold. Gold may be your best protection against all this. The Wall Street Journal has stated gold prices may be headed for record highs this year, and you're in luck. All you got to do is call the proud Americans of the Patriot Gold Group today before it's too late and mention my name. That's Michael Malice. You'll get best-in-class service from Patriots protecting Patriots. Patriot Gold Group has the no-fee-for-life IRA, where your IRA or 401k can be in physical gold or silver, and you may be eligible for the no-fee-for-life IRA and qualifying rollovers. All you got to do, call 888-505-9845 to get a free investor guide today, or even easier, go to malicegold.com. Patriot Gold Group is Consumer Affairs' top-rated gold IRA dealer 6 years in a row. So call 888-505-9845 or just go to malicegold.com. If you had been governor during COVID, which governorship would be kind of most similar to what you would have done, maybe with some few alterations?
Kristi Noem was pretty darn similar. Yeah, so that's probably what I would say. Give you a short answer on that one.
As president, you would have the power to pardon or commute people. And there's three people that I think people watching this would be very interested in hearing your take. If you haven't looked at their cases and want to punt to the future, that's perfectly fine. The first one, of course, is Julian Assange. Would you be interested in pardoning or commuting his sentence?
Yeah, I actually am familiar with this one deeply. So you're front running my announcement on this a little bit because I actually wanted to spend some time with Julian, but that's okay. I'll be honest to anyone who asks me a question. I'll pardon Julian Assange.
Okay.
Yeah.
The second question people have is Ross Ulbricht, who had created the Silk Road, and he now, I think, has 2 double life sentences. Are you familiar with his case?
I'm not.
Okay. And third, would you in a similar way to Gerald Ford, and I'll get the information to you about Russ Ulbricht at some point. Would you be interested in communing or pardoning former President Trump in the same way that Ford pardoned President Nixon?
Yes. In fact, I already wrote a Wall Street Journal op-ed about it shortly after his indictment. I would pardon Trump. And then the conventional wisdom says that you couldn't pardon Trump for a state crime in New York. I actually made the legal argument for why that's wrong, because the state prosecutor, the city prosecutor in Manhattan DA, is actually invoking or relying on a federal law to prosecute that case, which if that underlying crime were pardoned, then the state crime is pardoned too. So I've said for a number of reasons on principle, I would pardon President Trump. I've also said I would pardon Douglas Mackey. He is a guy who's facing up to 10 years in prison for making literally a joke on the internet about Hillary Clinton supporters, who, by the way, opponents of President Trump made the same joke, like exactly the same joke about President Trump's supporters. Of course, no prosecution, and it would have been weird if there was. But the weird part is there was a prosecution and a conviction. Douglas Mackey would be on my list to be pardoned. I would also pardon peaceful January 6th protesters, people who were denied due process rights, that were denied exculpatory evidence. I'm kind of one of the, I don't know where you are in this stuff, but back in the day, I was back in college, I was sort of one of the weird, quirky people who believed even in due process rights for the people held in Guantanamo Bay and Gitmo.
Of course, absolutely, yes. Because
So
if you're torturing people in Gitmo, in 2 minutes, anyone who supports the NRA will be labeled as a terrorist. And then what do you have?
right. I mean, it's just, they could do it to them. They could do it to you. Due process, we believe in it for a reason. And so that's me. But the thing that disappoints me is the people who were with me back then aren't saying a peep today when the same due process violations are levied against American citizens here on American soil. And that's an affront to me. And so, I think of myself as, a combination of that. You call that a libertarian instinct with the America First, Make America Great Again movement. That's, captures kind of where my ethos is as a candidate. And back then that was Republicans who were in favor of doing this stuff. So to me, it's not a Republican and Democrat thing so much as actually a first principles. America First, I wear that mantle proudly, but to me, being America First means reviving what America is, the principles that define America. It's part of why I've been very clear about all of those folks being on my pardon list.
And the last name I want to ask was Edward Snowden.
Yeah, Edward Snowden is the tough case. So I'm going to look at this one because
Okay.
what makes Julian Assange easy, for me at least, a lot of people don't think it's easy. I think it's an easy pardon, is he's a member of the press. He literally just published what other people gave him.
Well, that would imply that he should be in jail, right?
No. Why would it imply that he should be in jail?
Have you seen these people who work for the New York Times? My God, jail would be too nice for them.
Oh, yeah. Well, in that
We're
joking
joking.
sense.
We're joking.
The joking. Yeah, you're a funny
We're
guy.
joking.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm getting too serious here. I get riled up by these topics. But in all seriousness, though, that's what makes the Julian Assange case easy. The Edward Snowden case. So I studied the Julian Assange case much more closely than I have the Edward Snowden case. I respect what Edward Snowden has done for this country, exposing what otherwise would not have been exposed. The thing I struggle with there is it's sort of like back when I was in college. Seems unrelated, but I'll bring it back. Is like Larry Summers was president of Harvard, and there was all of these like Harvard students that would storm the academic hall and classrooms. And then, they would get a citation from the campus police or whatever, and it would go on their academic record. And then there was this thing where, because the things they were protesting were social injustices that Harvard was perpetuating in the world, they would then come back and say, well, it shouldn't go on our academic record. And my view at the time, I was in a room with Larry Summers, actually, as a student, told him the same thing, isn't part of what makes what they're doing brave the fact that they face the consequences of what they did. Right. And maybe for the cause they were advancing, that's noble. And that's just the way the world works, but the rules are the rules. And if you follow them, part of what makes you honorable is that you were willing to face those consequences. Anyway, I think you see the parallel, but that's what brings me back to Edward Snowden. I respect what he did for this country, but I also think we can't live in a country where, so long as you're going to have a military or whatever, that you play by the rules. He exposed corruption. There's a lot of other corrupt people that should be prosecuted that aren't for their failures. But part of the justice of the world and the poetic justice of it, I struggle with this one. And what I'm thinking through is, in my heart, I want to. But the way the world works might be that part of what makes him honorable is that he was willing to bear that punishment. In Julian Assange's case, that's different. He had no obligations that he signed up to this government. He wasn't even an American. He's just an international journalist who published what he was given. That's just the norm in Washington, D.C., is publishing leaked stuff from the government. It's just the way the press works. And so the fact that Chelsea Manning, who was the person who actually breached, I can't remember if it's a his or her, but I know it's a transgender. I lose track. I don't mean that disparagingly.
It's M to F. So
What's that?
It's Chelsea now. It was Brad before.
Okay, so I'm supposed to refer to as her then, I guess. Whatever.
Sure.
Okay,
You're fine.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to be disrespectful of people, but the transgender thing can sort of lose track sometimes. But anyway, this individual was pardoned. I think why I bring up the trans piece is this individual, I think, would not have been pardoned if this individual is not trans. That's what made it politically popular for Obama to issue that pardon without pardoning the actual person who just published what was leaked through that government breach. I think that's an affront, right? So I tend to be as principled as I can about these things. And, I will govern accordingly, and I will be clear about in advance what I actually intend to do. I won't hide the ball.
You earlier mentioned what I regard as one of the most malevolent agencies in DC, which is the Fed.
Yes.
President Trump, as candidate in 2015, promised by executive order he would audit the Fed. He did not do so. Do you have?
Did he say that?
Yes.
That's disappointing to me that he didn't do it. Because now I'm going to be in the position of saying I'll do the same thing.
That's what I'm asking you. Are you interested in auditing the Fed?
Yeah, of course. I've gone further than that. I have a clear vision because now we started to see what we would find in that audit anyway. I absolutely want to audit the Fed, but now there's unfortunately going to be fewer and fewer surprises because more and more of the disaster is now on full display for full frontal display. I said I would cut 90% of the headcount at the Fed. Right? There's about 22,000 people that work in the U.S. Federal Reserve System. I think the Federal Reserve is a toxic agency that has, like so many others, reached far beyond what its scope is supposed to be, right? So, the modern Federal Reserve for the last 25 years operates according to this mythology known as the Phillips curve. It's equivalent to the mythology of climate change that, the EPA and the SEC respond to today. That's a different mythology. Here's a different mythology here, is that there's a trade-off between unemployment and inflation, and that there can be such a thing as solving both of those by playing financial God by some central planning authority we call the Federal Reserve. It's like the equivalent of trying to hit two targets with one arrow. It's proven disastrous at addressing either unemployment or inflation. They shouldn't have been playing the game. The Federal Reserve has one job, which is to stabilize the U.S. dollar, period, which they've done a disastrous job of, and leaves the country, I'm getting the gesture that we're actually running out of our hour, or else I could probably go for 3 hours on this topic alone. But the long story short is we need fewer than 2,000 employees to do that. And when people show up to work who shouldn't have had a job in the first place, they find things to do. That's the story of the U.S. Federal Reserve. So under my watch, we'll audit it, but I'm already telling you what's going to happen at minimum. We're going to take it from over 22,000 employees to fewer than 2,000 and actually put it back in its place. Stabilize the dollar as a unit of measurement and stop the nonsense on this flawed New Zealand data set from old British data that says the Phillips curve is real. It's not. We're going to fix it.
I'm going to disagree respectfully. I think the role of the Fed isn't to stabilize the dollar. I think the role of the Fed is to fund the war machine by using inflation, which means taking money from the poorest of the poor in order to fund these Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney's second house.
We don't actually disagree. That's what the role of the Fed has been.
Yes.
I'm talking about what the role of the Fed should be, but you're spot on, brother. That's exactly right.
Are you just were on CNN with the man that President Trump has referred to as the dumbest man on television, Don Lemon. He's gotten a lot of heat for his supposed misogyny and just being a basic diva. He told you to your face, I want to get this quote exactly right. When you are in black skin and you live in this country, then you can disagree with me speaking about black gun ownership and civil rights. I guess you have to be a little bit darker. Maybe we can play with the tint. What was your measure of the man? And what was your reaction when he said this to you on camera to your face?
Well, we're on set, so we're there together. If I'm to size him up, I'd size up a very small individual, not physically speaking, but just in terms of the intellect there. But I don't fault someone for being high intellect or low intellect, right? I think there's a lot of ways to be a respectable human being, 100%. And I don't think that, I think that sometimes we over anchor to intellect. But I think that when you combine that with an intellectual hubris, then you have a problem, right? You have a disconnect. And I think that the fact that you have somebody who says that you can't make an argument because of the color of your skin, right? I'm teaching him about Civil War history and about the history of American Reconstruction that he didn't know. The only answer he had left to give me is that I couldn't say it because I was black. I reject that view. And there was a sort of weirdly ugly undercurrent that showed up in the heat of the moment. This is not the part I'm going to hold against him in any way, because in the heat of the moment, people say things, but he was just like, well, whatever ethnicity you are, I thought about whatever, I'm an Indian American and I'm proud of it, but I don't think that matters.
Right.
I think what matters is the content of the ideas we're debating, and we should be allowed to have this debate without me having to regard you as a black man. I think that really got under his skin. But it's a big part of why I go out of my way to do this stuff. I go out on CNN, I go on NBC networks, I go on left-wing press all the time, because actually too many in our camp, I'm going to call out my side on this, are afraid to do it. Of course the other side's unfair. I mean, just watch that video clip. It was unfair, and I still came out, if I may say it, probably unambiguously winning on their turf. I think we need to do more of that if we're going to have one country left at the end of this, not just preaching about free speech to our own tribe. I go to college campuses across this country inviting open debate for the same reason. I think we need a little bit more of that. And, it's what I think I'm going to continue doing in this race as long as I'm stopped from doing it by the other side.
It's funny because it seems like his mask dropped for a second and he's trying to do the calculus, and it's like, okay, is this guy Dominican? Then I can't talk down to him. If he's Indian, I'm allowed to. And he's just kind of running the numbers in his head.
Yeah.
That's very disturbing to see. You're actually getting great ROI on your campaign. You're polling better than people who are household names for years. Like Pompeo's not running. Glenn Youngkin, recently elected governor of Virginia, is not running, but you're polling ahead of them. So it seems almost a certainty that you are going to make the debate stage unless you run out of money, which I don't think is a concern in this case. Point being, are you like, what's going through your head knowing, unless you choose to drop out, that you are going to be going toe-to-toe with former President Trump and in all likelihood Governor DeSantis?
Oh, we're going the distance, right?
Okay.
I think that they're not going to relish having me on the debate stage. And I think that we're going to be no holds bar, kind of like what Trump did in 2015. That's what I'm bringing to the stage this time around. But I think with a grounding in principles and a constitutional conviction, that's what I'm bringing to the table. I'm looking forward to it. I think we're going to have a lot of fun. I think it's going to be good for the Republican Party. I think it's going to be good for the country. And, far from dropping out, we're going the distance on this. We will stop at nothing. I've already put an 8-figure sum of my own money. Our family will stop at nothing, but it's going to be a grassroots movement that lifts this up. If in the unlikely event that DeSantis doesn't enter this race, but suppose he doesn't, I could see a world where Trump chooses not to debate me, actually.
Oh, yeah.
I think that if DeSantis isn't in this race, I think there's a good chance Trump will choose not to be on the debate stage. I think that would be a shame. I think more debate's going to be good for our party, our movement, and our country. But from a calculus of self-interest, I just don't think other candidates in this race are going to relish being on the debate stage with me. Ron DeSantis definitely is not. I'll tell you that much. I could tell you a funny story another time. We've shared stages before, and I think he felt embarrassed actually a donor told me this afterwards, that he felt upstaged by me and he rushed off and was really angry one time when we shared a stage together. So in the future, when I've shared a stage with him, I go out of my way to compliment him because I think that helps him feel better and his self-esteem, and he speaks better. And so, that's the way I've treated it in my business career. But now we're in a race together. I'm not going to be holding back. But I think that in the unlikely event DeSantis doesn't enter this race, and he might not, I think it might be the decision he makes. I personally don't think he makes it past Super Tuesday. Going through Iowa and New Hampshire, I've been there a lot. I think they're able to really sense who is coming with talking points versus who actually has substance. Voters in those two states, and I'm a big fan now, more than ever, of first in the nation primary status and caucus status for those two states. They're doing a national service of actually vetting people in 3D rather than just the two-dimensional projections you get through digital or cable news channels. That's really important, but I don't think Ron DeSantis lasts that very far. I don't think he makes it past the early states to Super Tuesday, even if he gets in. So if he comes to that conclusion himself, kind of like a Scott Walker situation 8 years ago, then if he's not in the race, I think if he's in the race, Trump will be on the debate stage because I think Trump is very interested and probably will shine better than DeSantis does in those debates, and Trump knows it. But if DeSantis, in the unlikely event, isn't in this race, I think there's a good chance Trump chooses not to be on the debate stage with me. I hope that doesn't happen. I think it'll be good for the country if we're all on together. But either way, I think the debate stage is crucial. Anything before then is really irrelevant. That first debate's in August. I'll be on there, and I will not be holding back. I'll tell you that much.
I had been concerned that given your background, that you're basically another Andrew Yang figure, and I was delighted to learn from this interview that that's not at all the case. I really was impressed by what you had to say and how well you said it, and you weren't using corporate jargon, which, given your background, might be expected. I think you're giving very forthright and coherent and decent answers to everything I asked, and I think that was very impressive. We're running out of time. What has been your new book, by the way, is out this week. It's called Capitalist Punishment. Woke Inc. is out as well. We're running out of time. What has been your favorite part of this interview?
Oh, I think the honesty of it, actually. The fact that we're able to just go back and forth and you name some names. I didn't know what you were going to ask, but you asked me specific questions about pardons of individuals. I told you about the one I didn't know, but I gave you my honest answers to the rest. I think the fact that you create a little bit of a culture of honesty here. And, only thing I would say is if you do get professional politicians on, I think it'd be good most of them are good people, actually. They're just so practiced into this shell of preparation that they come into this with. And I know that I see some of the pressures of this, even among political consultants or otherwise. Just crack past that shell, keep doing what you're doing. And I think they'll show better, but I think that it'll be better for the country too, because people trust a process more when we all try to stop pretending being something that we're not. And I think you do a pretty good job of that. So I'm glad for it. And, we didn't end up talking about the book at all. I actually ended up writing the book before I knew I was going to run for president. It's Capitalist Punishment, and the subtitle sums it up. So maybe people feel like they got the punchline. It's how Wall Street's using your money to create a country you didn't vote for. But the goal there was to actually get pretty technical. Woke Inc. was at a higher level. This gets technical into the specifics of ESG. But I figured I had already written the book. It was supposed to be published now. I wasn't going to not publish it because I'm running for president. And I think people are actually going to take a lot away from it. I think people are going to learn some things about how their own money's invested and spent that will shock them. And I wouldn't recommend it as bedtime reading because some of it might make your blood boil before you go to bed. But I think if you had the choice between would you rather know it or not know it, I think most people would rather know it. And so that's a big part of why I'm putting it out.
You are welcome.
This is Walk-Ins Welcome with Bridget Fetisi.
I love hearing people's stories of resilience and grit. This is why I created this podcast.
We are very excited to welcome Jim Gaffigan, Yasmin Mohammed, Glenn Beck, Tim Dillon, Abigail Schreier, Jeff Garland, Ayan Hirsi Ali, Sam Harris, Heather Hying, Jonah Goldberg, Ben Shapiro, Glenn Greenwald, Sarah Shahi, Colin Quinn.
If there's a culture of victimhood, then let's tell stories of grit and survival.
Subscribe and listen now on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
See what's screaming all month long during Pluto TV's April Ghouls. Watch hauntingly good movies like Evil Dead and Cloverfield, or terrifying shows like The Walking Dead and Nosferatu. Plus, Pluto TV has hundreds of channels with thousands more movies and TV shows. Available on live and on demand. Download the free Pluto TV app on all your favorite devices. Pluto TV. Stream now. Pay never.